Hello, welcome to This Side of the Ceiling. I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Jill. And we're two good friends trying to live this life on this side of the ceiling as abundantly as Christ has called us to.
We are by no means experts, but we love to study His Word and share everything that He has revealed and taught us.
So come along with us as we open up the scriptures and dive into His wonderful Word.
Welcome once again to This Side of the Ceiling. Last week we left Peter in a hard place.
Oh, yeah.
And that's actually where we're going to pick up today. We're going to review that last story that we talked about when Jesus has been arrested and Peter is following at a distance. So I'm going to pick up in Luke chapter 22, verse 54. It says, "Then seizing him," who they meant Jesus, "they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, but when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, 'This man was with him.' But he denied it. 'Woman, I don't know him,' he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, 'You are also one of them.' 'Man, I am not,' Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, 'Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean.' Peter replied, 'Man, I don't know what you're talking about.' Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. 'Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times.' And he went outside and wept bitterly."
So we leave Peter in a puddle of tears.
Yes.
And our hearts are just aching because we all know we've let down Jesus. And
Yes.
we know that feeling of imagining looking at Jesus. And I think you said last time that probably was he probably thought that was the last time he ever saw him.
Right.
And didn't have a chance to make amends.
Right.
He thought. But that's the beauty of the lesson today. If we left you last week feeling a little despair, we're not going to apologize for it, because we need to sit in that sometimes.
Right.
And realize that we do let Jesus down. But the good news is today.
Yes.
And today we want to talk about that Peter learns the lesson of love. He realizes how much love covers of what we mess up. And so to do that, I want to go back before Peter denies Jesus, but that same night. Let's go back just a little bit, and I want to read from John 13. I think everybody knows John 13. It's the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. But hopefully, if you've been with us through the study of Peter, you're beginning to feel something for Peter, and maybe some of these stories will hit you with fresh eyes. I know they have me. I feel like I'm getting to know Peter so much better. But in John 13, verse 1, it says, "It was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love." The main point of this is love, and I hope that comes over. And it says right here, Jesus knew that he was running out of time with his disciples. Jesus had a public ministry to the people. He was healing people. He was feeding 5,000. He was
speaking parables.
Yes, on the mountainside. But he also had a very private ministry with these disciples, these chosen few, who he was explaining, and he needed them to carry on his ministry. So this is a very private ministry, and we get a peek into it. And so Jesus knows that his time is running out with them, and the Bible says, he needed to show them the full extent of his love. So what does love look like? How is he going to teach his disciples what love looks like? Okay, let's keep reading, and I'm going to start in verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Now, I'm going to stop right there because we see once again Peter is all in.
Right.
He starts out by saying, and first of all, obviously nobody's washed the feet. Nobody has done this, which I understand to be a normal custom that you would do since you're gathering around to eat. Of course, we don't see any women around, so the men have forgotten. There's nobody there, and maybe they're just being dirty or whatever, but nobody has done that. It's too beneath anybody. And Jesus gets up, takes off his robe, and starts washing their feet. And, Simon Peter calls him Lord. You're not going to wash my feet. You'll never. And Jesus says, you have no part with me. And then immediately Peter says, well, then wash every bit of me. Wash all of me. And he's either all or nothing.
Yeah.
That is Peter. And
back and forth.
Yes. And quick.
Trying to get it. Trying to understand.
Yes. And so when he realizes he doesn't, I can't have anything, then wash all of me. Wash every bit of me.
Yeah.
I love that about Peter.
Yeah.
So Jesus, that's the lesson. And Jesus tells him, you're not going to get this now, Peter, but you will. Later, this will make sense. And you just think these light bulbs must have gone on after they get the Spirit. So continuing in verse 10, Jesus answered, a person who's had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body's clean. And you're clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Jesus has given them this great object lesson that the best way you show love, because it said Jesus showed them the fullest extent of his love, is to serve people.
Yeah, he got on his knees and washed their feet.
Yeah, is action. And love is action, and it's serving. That's the best way, is to serve. And it doesn't matter your role. He said, yep, I am your Lord. I am your teacher. And look what I did. Now you go do that.
Right.
Now, as we go on, I'm going to skip down here. It says, if you look back, and I will say, when Jesus says, not all of you are clean, I don't think he was talking about Peter, I think he was saying, Peter, you're clean. You just need me to wash your hands and feet. He specifically says that to Peter. Right. But Judas wasn't. He knew. Right. He knew that Judas wasn't clean. Judas needed more help. Mm-hmm. And, we don't get more privy into what was really going on with him. But if you look in verse 21, it says, after all of this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it's the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. What you're about to do quickly, Jesus told him. But at the meal, no one understood why Jesus had said this to him. So they don't get that.
No,
they don't get that.
That would be hard.
Yeah, they don't get that. That happens. But notice now, we're back. I'm jumping to verse 31. Jesus very quickly gets back to the point of what he's talking about. And he says, once again, back to this point of love. He says, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. See how many times he says love?
Yes.
He is not He is making sure he drives this point home. I'm talking about love. Serve each other. Watch each other's feet. Love one another. Just like I've loved you, love each other. This is how people are going to know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. Verse 36, Simon Peter says, Lord, where are you going? Jesus replied, where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now, we know that is true and that's going to happen, but I want our listeners to realize there is some growth here in Peter. Yes. Doesn't look like it, but if they've been with us from the beginning of this series, one of the first lessons we did, we were back in, I believe it was Matthew 16, and, Peter has just made this statement that Jesus has said the Spirit revealed to him, and then Jesus introduces this idea to the disciples that he's going to have to be killed. And so he says, I need you to know that the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law, that I have to go be killed, and on the 3rd day I'll be raised to life. And Peter says, Matthew 16:22, never, Lord, this will never happen to you. And so notice here, back in John 13, Jesus says again, I'm going to have to lay down my life, and Peter says, I'm ready to go lay down my life with you. I'm ready to go die with you. So we see growth in Peter. He's not saying, I'm going to step in and save the day. This will never happen to you.
Right.
He's saying, okay, if you got to go somewhere to die, I'll go with you. I'll die with you.
Yeah.
You got to love that heart for Peter.
Yes.
So I think in John 13, Jesus is trying to show his disciple that the way you show love is to serve, and it's going to be very, very important that they love each other. That is still the way that we know we're each other's disciples, when we love people. So the question becomes, did Peter learn that lesson? And I believe he did, because older Peter, in 1 Peter, the letter, in 1 Peter 4:8, we read that Peter says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. And Peter knew that.
Yes.
He saw that Jesus's love for Peter had covered over some major sins of denying him.
Right.
And
that he even knew him, denied that he even knew him.
Yeah, and basically made him a liar, because he said, I'd never do that. I'll never deny you.
Yeah.
And he does. And
3 times.
Yeah, so there was no question about it. But yet, at the end of his writings, Peter says, above everything else, love each other deeply, which is what Jesus was telling them. This is my last thing to tell you. And then Peter, in his last little chapters that we get, says, above everything else, love each other deeply. So Peter learned that lesson.
Yes.
But he learned it also in a very sweet way, which I think you're going to talk about.
Yeah, so Jesus is risen from the dead, and he's appearing to his disciples. And I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 21 of John. And this is where it's probably a familiar story, but this is probably about the 3rd time he's appeared to his disciples. And Peter and some of the disciples decide to go out fishing. And so they're in a boat fishing, and it says, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your nets on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. So Peter jumps in the water.
Yeah, all in again.
Yes, he is excited that Jesus is there, that Jesus has come again to them. And so they have breakfast with Jesus. And then in verse 15 it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, so he has this conversation with Peter specifically, and it says, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that